All right, so we had a gentleman from an organization that wants us to look at uh, how we choose, what we choose to eat, and to consider the various implications of those choices. And he was a vegetarian, vegan. I personally am not. But there's some choices uh, that are some considerations that really need to be looked at uh, closely. And I'm going to send you a video I found on YouTube, and it's only 5 minutes long, especially for those of you that missed the class. It's important that you take a look at it. Those of you that don't remember didn't take good notes, it's a second opportunity for you to take some notes and write down some ideas. There's also a Scientific American article I'm sending you that you should take a look at and read. And just to consider some of the implications of our choice to eat meat. Most of the websites that I looked at, health sites, including Harvard Men's Health and the Cleveland Clinic and several other sites, have said that we really should be eating less meat. Some sites suggest 2 to 3 days a week should be our target for eating meat. Others say to pick 2 or 3 days where we go meatless, just to decrease the amount of meat that we eat as individuals in our society. If you watch the video, I think you'll see that what's the unfortunate truth is that more and more people of the world are choosing to eat meat like Americans, where we might eat 3 meats a day, one per meal. This is an unsustainable, and that's that word sustainability that we talked about in class. It's an unsustainable practice. We can't possibly keep eating meat the way we have been. The reason we can't keep eating meat is because of how much meat we eat as a planet. If you remember correctly, we eat as a planet 6 million animals every hour. 6 million an hour are being eaten by humans. That's not including the waste, right? Again, watch that 5-minute video and take a look at the waste that we create just by the fish that we eat. We're not even talking about cows or pork. The question of sustainability is a question that, well, let's try to define what sustainability means first of all before we continue. And this is for something to be sustainable, we have to be able to keep doing it with the resources that we have for the foreseeable future, right? So if we can think, well, if we eat we can keep eating 6 million animals per hour for the next few hundred years, there's no real issues with it, then we would say it's sustainable. But because there's so many issues with this rate, right? This is a rate. Remember, a rate is how much or number of something over time, right? So at 6 million animals per hour, that's a rate that's just unsustainable. We will run out of resources. Now, the fact that we're choosing to eat meat also means that we're choosing that it's not just the meat, it's the water that feeds into the meat, and that's what we talked about in class a little bit. We touched on it, and our speaker will come back next week to discuss a little more of it. But it's our water use and our land use that's an issue, because to grow and maintain those cows and pigs and chickens, it takes a lot of land and a lot of water, much more water than humans take up. And something we didn't put on my original chart, and we didn't really discuss too much, so I'm sure we will next week, is, it's related to physiology, and that's poop, right? Those animals poop, and because they poop, they produce material that's noxious, and it ends up in the land and the groundwater, and it pollutes our rivers. And so this is an issue. Then there's a question of our physiology. Is our physiology one that's really evolved well to handle eating meat, especially every day? Certainly, eating meat once in a while. I don't think anyone would argue that that's not something that humans evolved to do over time. But eating meat every day seems to be a little bit of an excess. Um, Now, when we talk about the physiology, and then we compared it to chimpanzees, if you remember, and as you see here, one of your colleagues wrote a concept map, and he took those notes he took in class, or she, I don't remember who it was that gave me this sample. They did give me permission to show it, though. If we take a look here, you see that he decided to take a look at waste, right? He took a look at the DNA relationship between chimpanzees, and he asked the question that was asked in class, whether our intestines and teeth are involved to be able to digest that much meat a day. And we compared the chimpanzees to ourselves, since we have 98% similarity in our DNA, and therefore probably our physiology, right? So this is what we're talking about when talking about physiology. Physiology is the processing of energy and materials, right, by your body. And if we share 98.9% of our DNA with chimpanzees, then we would think our physiologies are very similar. And if their intestines and teeth are so much alike, and our intestines are, our digestive system so much alike, shouldn't our diets then therefore be similar? Well, there's some research both ways, really. It turns out that it might be because we eat more meat, our brains actually evolved to be more intelligent, to be able to do more than a chimpanzee's brain. But then there's some other research that might make you question it. But for the most part, people suggest that meat eating is one of the benefits. Of meat eating is an increased intelligence. But was it necessarily eating 5 meats a day or a week? Was it necessarily eating 7 meats a week? How often did our ancestors eat meat versus the diets of chimpanzees, which would be the fruits, the vegetables, the nuts? Which diet was our diet that we evolved to be able to take advantage of? Then we looked at this gentleman here, a lady wrote down, the fact that we use 80% of our antibiotics are being used on livestock instead of people, which leads to antibiotic-resistant strains, which one of your colleagues mentioned in class. And that antibiotic-resistant strain of bacteria, in part, in any case, comes from this overuse of antibiotics by our food industry, by that whole factory farming techniques that we looked at. The fact that chickens are made in 8 weeks, from birth to 8 weeks to slaughter, that we overfeed them, we feed them antibiotics so they get bigger, that we house them in unsanitary conditions, that we do all these things in order to make the cash required to make it a profitable venture, right? Otherwise, why would someone raise all those chickens to feed people? They do it to make money, and which is not a crime in itself. But the question then becomes, are we really being efficient with that system? And if we're taking our cash, and if the money in raising these chickens and cows, etc., is costing us our resources, is it worth it? Right. So our resources, and what resources are we talking about? Water, land, right? Clean water specifically, and of course the antibiotics that we're talking about here. That's a very precious resource, because without them, many of us would not be here. If you've gotten a bad cut or an injury or an infection, There's probably an antibiotic that saved you. And without antibiotics, we're dealing with some fairly sad consequences for a lot of people in the near future. So there's a lot of factors that go into eating meat, and there's a lot of questions that could be connected in a concept map. And I sent you already a link for a concept map. And again, here you have your food, and we have, the ethics. You have to consider the ethics of eating meat. What is it about an animal that we choose is okay to eat a chicken, for instance, and not a dog? And these are cultural choices. Do we just put that aside? Is it instinct or is it learned? Is there pain involved in the animal's death? And I think everyone would agree there is some pain involved. It's a sacrifice we're willing to make because we feel it's necessary. But then the question is, do we have to? Should we? And do we have to? And what's the impact of all these cows and all these chickens on biodiversity? And remember what biodiversity is. Remember that biodiversity is this idea that when you look at a square acre of land, you would normally see a whole bunch of different animals and plants. And there are cats that feed on mice and chickens that feed on worms. And there's just zootopia, if you want, of different animals in this square acre and the plants that they feed on and habitat in. And this one square acre of land normally has this variety or diversity of life. Now, if you take a square acre of factory farming, or actually any agricultural venture, but let's say factory farming, what you're going to see is one type of animal. If you're a cattle rancher, the only thing you're going to have in this square acre is beef, right? Cattle. So now, what have you done automatically? You've taken this square acre of land and you've changed the biodiversity. You've decreased the biodiversity. Where you used to have all these animals and plants living in that square acre, now you only have cattle or only chicken or only corn, right? So in a 1 square acre, it's not that big a deal. But if you take it is a big deal, but it's not as big a deal as what's happening here. And that's that we're taking an entire chunk of the country, an entire chunk of many countries. And what we're doing is we're making this monoculture, this one type of animal, one type of plant living on all this land. And that leaves no land for all these other species. And so because there's this driving need to eat beef or chicken or pork, we're driving the land and water use to be used to raise these chickens, beef, and pork. And so our choices, our economic choices of what we eat, are driving an environmental disaster, because we're not only are we reducing the biodiversity, right? We're overusing water, we're overusing our land, there's a whole ethics consideration that you can choose to accept or put aside, which is fair. You can do anything, with this particular concept of the food we eat. I think this is a personal choice, but if you wish to choose to consider the pain and of animals that we eat, then that's a consideration. How much meat, or what's good for us to eat and what isn't good for us to eat. As I said, most of the sources I looked at said 2 to 3 times a week, where most of us eat 3 times a day meat. How is the ecology impacted? How is our own physiology impacted? Higher cholesterol, higher saturated fat, more heart disease, kidney issues, the list goes on. Obesity, obviously. And then sustainability. Can we sustain it? Considering all these things, the question is this a sustainable model? Can we continue to eat all this meat and sustain it over the next few hundred years? Or are there bad things about to happen to our society because of this giant demand for meat, right? And animals and animal products, because it's not just eating meat, it's also the cheese and the milk that we that we desire as well. We want so much milk and cheese and etc. But that means there has to be a lot of cows, milk cows. They have to be kept in, again, unsanitary conditions, which increases antibiotic use, which increases water use, which increases land use, and we have to get those cows milked. Then we process the milk. I mean, there's a whole list of things that we have to consider when you're considering the use of animals in this fashion. So, again, if you weren't there during the lesson, then go ahead and watch the 5-minute video and or read the Scientific American article that I'm going to send along with this video. This would be an excellent example of a concept map. This would be an A+. It is an A+. Great job. I'm not going to tell you which student did it, but this student did an A+ job. This person was able to show me in their concept map the major sections of, that were covered in the lecture by our expert, by our visitor. He or she was able to put them in a concept map. They were able to make the connections between the main ideas. They were able to, I think, do it fairly neatly. So this person did a great job. They checked off all the necessary points for a concept map. So this is the kind of concept map I would like to see from you. Now, I want to see your connections. What were your connections from all the facts that we had discussed? Again, if you weren't in class, watch the 5-minute video or read the Scientific American article. And, here's my example of the concept map that I drew as on the board as the speaker was speaking. So continue. Hopefully you did this concept map already, and you're just saying, oh, I did it great. I'm done. I have it just like this guy did or girl. And make sure that you have, something that's presentable, because I'd like to hang up your concept map. I hope this helps build your concept map.